In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and, because he does so, respects the rights of others, the neighbor who respects his obligations and respects the sanctity of agreements in and with a world of neighbors. That declaration represented my purpose then, it represents my purpose now, but it represents more than a purpose now, for it stands for a practice. To a measurable degree, the practice has succeeded, and the whole world now knows that the United States cherishes no predatory ambitions. We are strong, but less powerful nations know that they need not fear our strength. We seek no conquest, we stand for peace. In the whole world of the Western Hemisphere, our
The Good Neighbor policy was a foreign statement regarding the relations between the United States and certain nations in Latin America. Roosevelt publicized this policy in 1933, stating three major points regarding Cuba, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. The Good Neighbor policy stated that the U.S. would support Fulgencio Batista's overthrow of the Cuban government. It also gave Panama more control of the Panama Canal, and lastly, it pulled troops out of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. This policy proved that the U.S. would have good relations with nations in the South American region. The Good Neighbor policy was the Americans' way of showing that they would get involved in the lives of these nations' people if they felt the desire to do so, such as the situation with Cuba. However, it also showed that the U.S. would allow for self-determination. By giving Panama more control of the canal and taking troops out of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, it was evident that the U.S. was willing to have equal and fair relations. All in all, the Good Neighbor policy allowed for the improvement of foreign relations with Latin American nations.
Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
with confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain.
On December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the relentless Japanese forces that had unleashed a barrage of raids on the U.S. battleships that had been stationed at the docks. The next day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke with a great amount of pride and emotion and stated one of his most famous lines, "A date that will live in infamy." The nation was left in awe after such an immense attack was committed on the United States. The bombing of Pearl Harbor is an event that no one can forget, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's speech in response to this horrific attack is just as significant. When Roosevelt had addressed the nation of this attack, he had two tasks to complete. Roosevelt needed to urge the members of Congress to declare war upon the nation of Japan, and he needed to rally supporters for the war effort. Additionally, throughout the speech, Roosevelt needed to represent the Japanese as the enemy, so he used vivid and emotional words like premeditated invasion, onslaught against us, and deliberately sought to deceive to characterize Japan's actions as dishonorable and unreasonable. In addition, he used repetition to emphasize certain points, like when Roosevelt stated, "Yesterday, Japanese forces attacked Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippine Islands, Wake Islands, and Midway Island." When Roosevelt is expressing this statement, he is attempting to amplify two words, and they are Japan attacked.
This is a talk on national security, because the nub of the whole purpose of your president is to keep you now and your children later and your grandchildren much later out of a last-ditch war for the preservation of American independence and of all the things that American independence means to you and to me and to ours. Never before, since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, has our American civilization been in such danger as now. The Nazi masters of Germany have made it clear that they intend not only to dominate all life and thought in their own country, but also to enslave the whole of Europe, and then to use the resources of Europe to dominate the rest of the world. In view of the nature of this undeniable threat, it can be asserted properly and categorically that the United States has no right.
It has been more than a year since the world fell into the plight that is World War II. The U.S. national security has never been at more of a risk due to the sinister and power-hungry Nazi Germany, who want nothing more than to conquer Europe and eventually the entire world. In the presence of such a nefarious threat, FDR states that U.S. cannot justify the use of peaceful reasoning and negotiation to try and subdue the German threat. FDR says that we, as the United States, are fortunate that the Axis powers are not remotely close to the shores, as all of the fighting is in Europe and in the Pacific. The British and Chinese forces against Germany and Japan, respectively, while we have our fleet in the Pacific Ocean, not participating at all. Just ignoring the dangers that Germany is bringing will not be enough to erase the fear from our hearts. Germany's actions as an aggressor nation are also completely immoral. Germany's justification for conquering Belgium was to protect it from the British forces, and now they're using camps set up in Belgium against the British now. The nation could use the same excuse to conquer Latin America to protect it from the United States invasion. This speech shows that the United States cannot stand idle, allowing Germany and the Axis powers to ravage the world.
The Atlantic Charter was a formal document created on August 14, 1941, between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. It outlined post-war situations between the United States and Great Britain, and it consisted of 8 goals that both nations needed to attain. The first point was that the U.S. and Great Britain could not seek aggrandizement, which means that they would not be allowed to amplify their prestige and power through territorial gains. The next goal was that the people's opinion would be considered in territorial adjustments. The third idea was that self-determination would be a mandatory right of all people. which is basically saying that a person will, under any circumstances, control his or her own life. The Atlantic Charter also talked about the planned effort to lower trade regulations, allowing for better economic success of both nations. Another point was the emphasis of advancing social welfare of all people and global economic triumph. The next 2 points consisted of freedom. The sixth goal was freedom from fear of aggressor nations and economic downfall, as well as freedom from want. While the seventh objective was the significance of freedom of the seas, which would also allow economic success and peaceful relations. The last point was the fact that they would work towards the disarmament of belligerent nations. Overall, the Atlantic Charter was a major document created between the U.S. and Great Britain to allow for the success of the post-war world.
The quarantine speech was given by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on October 5, 1937, in the city of Chicago. During this speech, Roosevelt calls for an international quarantine of the aggressor nations as an alternative to the political situation of American neutrality and isolationism that was prevalent during this time period. This speech had intensified America's isolationist stand, causing protests by isolationists and opponents of intervention. Although no countries were directly mentioned within the speech was intended for aggressor nations such as Japan, Italy, and Germany because these nations were invading others. Roosevelt had suggested the use of economic pressure and more forceful response rather than aggression. By remaining vague, Roosevelt had the advantage of not committing himself to a specific policy or set of actions. Public reception of this speech was positive and negative, and Roosevelt did openly follow up on his statements. Instead of retaliating, he continued to work within the constraints imposed on him to resist the rise of aggression that was occurring around the globe.
In 1939, U.S. Congress the Neutrality Act. In this document established during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, the United States is on the brink of global war. Europe had already begun to engage in war, and at this point, the U.S. wanted to embrace their isolationism and remain out of the war. However, the nation wanted to aid the Allies fighting against the evils of Hitler and fascism. The Neutrality Act of 1939 is the United States' way to stay out of the war by being able to aid the Allies. The regulations in the act pertain to the warring nations or belligerents. Any American vessel carrying passengers or any articles to a belligerent nation will be fined for up to $50,000 or imprisoned for 5 years. And belligerents must arrange for the transport of U.S. goods by their own ships, immediately pay with cash, and assume all transportation risks. This principle is known as the cash and carry principle. Every American vessel will have to file with the collector of customs of the port a list of articles and cargo and the ports the goods are going to. The act also makes it illegal to trespass in combat areas with up to a $50,000 fine or 5 years in prison as consequence. The act also states that travel on belligerent vessels and arming of American vessels will be illegal. The purchase and sale of government obligations such as bonds to belligerents is illegal. This act completely severed economic ties with the warring countries. Hitler saw this as an act of cowardice, saying that a half-Judaized, half-negrified U.S. was incapable of conducting war. Historian Robert Dallek analyzed the actions Franklin Delano Roosevelt took during important events with Winston Churchill prior to the United States entering World War II. One event Dell looked at was the Atlantic Charter, where FDR and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met together in a summit meeting. This summit meeting between the two great Allied leaders was about Nazi fascism and how they would combat the looming danger. The two reached a conclusion that the defeat of Nazi Germany was a paramount goal for the two democracies. Dallek looks back at this memorable meeting and recognizes that Roosevelt's belief of clashing with those who threatened Western civilization being the unrivaled approach to the predicament the nation found itself to be very helpful in reaching a mutual agreement with the heavy-egoed Prime Minister. Dallek believes Roosevelt had done a great job negotiating with Winston Churchill and commends the president for it. Another event Dallek looked at was Churchill reaching for Roosevelt's help about not being able to pay for U.S. supplies no longer. Roosevelt found himself in quite a dilemma as he needed a way to help Britain without summoning the wrath of Congress to smite his plea. He cleverly created Lend-Lease, allowing Britain to receive supplies and using an analogy to justify Britain borrowing supplies from America to help defend the United States from the Nazis. He uses the analogy of having your neighbor's house on fire, and he comes running to you asking for a hose. Being the good neighbor that you are, you would give the hose to your neighbor, helping him douse out the fire, stopping it from potentially spreading it to your house. Dalek believes that this analogy was a wonderful way for him to sell to the public, and that was his political genius. Dalek believed this innovation was very brilliant from Roosevelt, especially in the dire situation he was in.
You're done? Finish the first paragraph, right?
Oh, shoot. Cynthia M. Koch of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York, views President Roosevelt with high regards after taking such vigorous actions in the time of war, but questions Roosevelt for denying the Jewish refugees access into America. She continues by expressing disapproval towards his action, but immediately overlooks it because of Roosevelt's beneficial impacts to the world rather than just to the United States. Cynthia then progresses to explain President Roosevelt's activeness during the two wartime conferences with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. She believes that Roosevelt had been the mediator between the other two leaders because the other leaders weren't that practical when it came to afterward decisions. Subsequently, she quotes Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.'s statement in which he expresses, "Take a look at our present world. It is manifestly not Joseph Stalin's world. That ghastly world self-destructed before our eyes. Nor is it Winston Churchill's world. Empire and its glories have long since vanished into history. The world we live in today is Franklin Roosevelt's world." Cynthia strongly believes that Franklin Roosevelt's presidency was a complete success after looking back at his possible actions during the wartime and the way he handled such complications. As the director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, she concludes that Roosevelt was a president that was held with high regard by the American people and the past presidents. Finally, Cynthia expressed that Franklin D. Roosevelt could be compared to with some of the greatest presidents in history, therefore establishing her perception that Roosevelt's presidency was nothing less than success.
The final review of President Roosevelt was by the Washington Post, in which it stated that he is both selfish and uncaring as well as very beneficial and erudite. Historian Alan Nevins proclaimed that Roosevelt's actions as president are nothing comparable to that of previous presidents Woodrow Wilson and Thomas Jefferson, as well as Prime Minister of Great Britain Winston Churchill. Nevins strongly believed this because of how he saw Roosevelt's mind as being one-dimensional and lacking the necessary trait of seeing and planning ahead. This could be seen in the conflict that would eventually escalate into the Cold War. Roosevelt had realized near the end of World War II that relationships with the Soviet Union were rapidly deteriorating. However, Roosevelt did not do much to amend these issues. Nevins also criticized Roosevelt as being profoundly conservative. He proved this idea with Roosevelt's refusal to allow Jewish people into the United States when they were fleeing from the expanding German Empire. On the other hand, however, Roosevelt was given positive reviews from the Washington Post as well. Historian Fred I. Greenstein referred to Roosevelt as the second-best president in the history of the United States, behind the one and only Abraham Lincoln. Greenstein believed that the powers of the president did not just undergo a shift for the better, it went under a metamorphosis. Greenstein felt that Roosevelt left a great legacy as president through his foreign successes such as the momentous victory over World War II. Yes, Roosevelt had Great Britain and the Soviet Union to help as allies. However, with the animosity that existed between Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, it was very hard to stay on the same page. Though it was Roosevelt that held the three together. As stated before, Roosevelt was also criticized for not ameliorating the estranged relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Though Roosevelt is defended as not being the catalyst that pushed both nations into the war. In reality, it was Harry Truman, Roosevelt's successor, that pushed Joseph Stalin over the edge. Throughout it all, Roosevelt had his flaws, but was seen as an overall benign and advantageous president.